Poetry has a long history of discussing rationality, at times quite explicitly, as in the work of Sufi mystics in the ghazal form. Amin Benani specifically observes that for Rumi, in these endless contests between reason and love, between systems of intellect and God, quote, out of the bruising encounter with love comes the vigor, end quote. In other words, one needs to be broken by love to be broken open, and indeed, one poem uses the shocking, striking image of how the split tongue of the pen runs twice as smooth as it would have had it not suffered the fissure. It seems that reason, as much as self, must suffer if love is to thrive, if one is to transcend the mundane, or find the divine within it. Such work is hardly isolated to the poetry of Rumi, Ghalib, Sufi mystics, or ghazals. In a very real way, irrationality is central to the work of poetry. It is, we might posit, an extant theory of madness already in the world. We work with a number of poets who we might identify as mad poets. Bipolar psychiatrist Gay Redfield Jamison and her critical text Touched with Fire. Theodore Roethke, who was identified to be bipolar. Wallace Stevens, posthumously considered a depressed poet. Josh Charles and Cathy Park Hong, who have self-identified their own depression. And Paul Celan, with his extensive trauma and subsequent suicide. Mad people have been writing mad poetry for a long time. Non-mad poets have been doing the work of unreason too, sometimes working against, in fact, the very concept that rationality and unreason do not, somehow coexist. So we also focus on work that is presumably non-mad, which might show that poetry does mad work even when not by mad people. We look at Jan Mieskowski's Crises of the Sentence, citing Paul, citing Hegel. We look at Aram Saroyan's famous poem Light, which does deep work in dislocating a reader from presumed reference, disrupting the relationship between learned signal for any given sign. Namely, poetry often navigates what's legible and illegible, in vision, in sound, in semiotics, using shared signs to call out against language's strictures of rationality, against limiting factors of the socially agreed upon, revealing the irrational within a seemingly shared, concrete, and rational mode. But we do focus on mad poets and theories of how poetry might be an extant theory of madness in the world, namely, that Cartesian binaries often draw firmer, broader dichotomies, namely that rationality and unreason are inherently opposite forces. And many have written on this tie between artists and madness, placing them firmly on the opposite side of reason. Sheda Kavai resists this Cartesian binary, this either-or positionality, that one is either sane or mad, normal or abnormal. Instead, Kavai proffers another positionality that resists this rigid binary structure, building on Gloria Anzaldua's Bork-on-Border theory and Jacqueline Zitta's queer theory. As an embodied experience, Kafai experiences the world in between. She says, a mad border body exists in between the fixed definitions of sanity and madness. This body is a dual inhabitant. Our experience of madness parallels this, and poetry, we think, does a similar necessary work in reorienting our relationship to reason, our understanding of how unreason functions in the world, and what kind of knowing we value. Namely, in the work of Cathy Park Hong and Josh Charles, we talk about the conflation and destruction of boundaries, the conflation, inversion, and erasure of binaries. Park Hong, in her book Dance Dance Revolution, writes a kind of future language, a vernacular, a Creole language that has formed from a variety of Romantic and Asian dialects and vocabularies, presented in seeming English, which requires a reader to reorient themselves entirely to reference they are not likely to have all of. Josh Charles, writing in part from a place of transness, a state of being across binary gendered boundaries, does similar work with registers and ages of English, from Old English to text message and internet slang. These works refuse linearity or fixedness in time or culture, and exists in that place Kafai considers in between and embodied. To some degree, then, poetry as an extant theory of madness is valid for us because we say it is. In a broader view, it is so by dint of Carolyn Miller's definitions of genre, who defined it within the context of ways in which an actual rhetors and audiences have of comprehending the discourse they use. Here again we return to deep motions of rationality to explain madness, which either has no words or simply cannot function within the bounds of Western linguistic conventions. Its intentions are to enforce clarity and logic, to elevate individualized, concretized meanings of words over complexity. In this way, the technology of poetry allows for the same medium, language, to express what is otherwise ineffable within its own conventions. And the methodology of shared erasure poems allow for madness to be shared, normalized, held, and cared for. The injurious madness of the world recedes, and the joy of shared madness creates a new reality. Mad studies, we posit, must not only look into madness, but reconsider stamping out methodologies for doing so. Must reconsider that Western academics and Western language conventions may fail inherently at providing a holistic or productive mad studies.